The next paper we're going to take a look at is Learning by Doing, Applying the Concept of Pollen Viability in a Horticulture Classroom by Kauahi Perez. So learning by doing is the thought that when you're teaching somebody something, if they're hands-on about it and if they actually do it, they're more inclined to remember it later. The author wished to apply this in the area of horticulture using pollen viability, which looks at how good the pollen is or how good it will be for a breeding program. Looking at pollen viability, there were two different factors they were looking at. They were looking at germination of the pollen, like how many germinate, same as you would with seeds, and the quality of the pollen tube that grows when the pollen germinates. This was done in vitro, which means in a nice little petri dish. So when you're looking at pollen viability, media really matters. What you're growing or germinating the pollen on is really important. So for this, they wanted to look at a pH of 5.0, 5.5, and 6.0, and sucrose levels of 10%, 15%, and 20%. What they're doing, though, is they're looking at this inside of a classroom setting. And they wanted the students to evaluate this and see what was the best one for the two Plumera cultivars they were using, as well as get the hands-on experience and learn what pollen viability is. So ahead of time, they prepped for this class. They made the medias using the various pHs and sucrose concentrations, and then they added the pollen and they allowed it 24 hours in the dark to germinate. So the next day is when they hold the class. The class was an undergraduate class made of majors and non-majors, 15 students total, and it's a 45-minute lecture class. So the breakdown on how they taught this class was they went with a 15-minute explanation where they told them what pollen viability was, showed them slides of what they're looking for in both germination and what they're looking for as far as what the pollen tubes should look like, good ones and bad ones. They kind of gave the quick, here's what you're doing, here's how to use a microscope, and all of that. They followed this with a hands-on flower dissection of the plumeria flowers. Author didn't specify how long that part took, but they had them actually dissect the plumeria flowers so they could see how they differ from a standard flower that you would see in like your textbook. There was also a question set that went with this. So not only did they have to dissect the flowers, they had to then answer questions about the flowers and their use in horticulture and their value. Next, the class of 15 students were broken up into groups of 3, so 5 groups of 3, and they were each given a pH with 3 different sucrose concentrations in a dish to look at. So they placed these under a microscope and they used a cell counter in order to determine germination out of 100%, rank it out of 100%. So they would 3 different times, they'd move the slide around and count how many germinated out of how many. How many did, how many didn't, until they got to 100, but they did it 3 times. And then they recorded all this on a group sheet. Now, they ran into a problem with this experiment in the lecture setting. The problem was they didn't finish. The author attributed this to several things. There were 3 cell counters and 5 groups, so they had to one set's doing cell counters, one's looking at pollen tubes, and then swap. There was also a case where some of the pollen grains were clumped up, and it made it a lot harder to count, especially for someone who didn't have any experience doing this prior to this lecture class. So the guest instructor, which I'm assuming is the author in this case, completed the thing, did all the counts and everything, compiled all the information, and then emailed the data out to the students and asked them if they had any questions. What they didn't do was actually ask any questions. The author concluded this would be better suited for a 3-hour lab section, but it did have positives. It gave scientific training and some experience to these students in this area, and hopefully with it being hands-on, they learned more.